How important was it to write this book now at this particular moment in time? I'm kind of thinking about the world we live in at the moment, the problems it faces politically, ecologically, and also like the fact that quite a few of the kind of key participants in the counterculture are getting on, and perhaps the story won't be around for an awful lot longer.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've identified the two persuasive reasons for doing it now. To start with the second one, the generation, the events I've written about here began over 50 years ago now. This is, the real protagonists of the story are the baby boomers who started to come of age in the 60s, started to look at the world they were inheriting and ask a lot of questions. And, sadly, I was looking at the list of people I interviewed for this book, and there were, something like 50 or 60 interviews that I did. And there'd be more than half a dozen that aren't with us anymore, and that's just in the space of about the 3 or 4 years since I started writing the book. One or two I realised just in time, and I'm very glad I did. Their stories were essential. But yeah, that's right. If this primary material isn't collected now, then it's gone. Then what you're left with is a lot thinner. It's just secondary sources. It's what was written at the time or what someone told someone. But the other thing you identified, which is absolutely right, is that I think that period, the era that we refer to as being the counterculture era of the 60s and 70s, I think this is a very pertinent time to look at it again, because it was a time of great idealism. It was a time when a lot of problems with the way the world was going were identified, and the beginnings of movements to address these things can be traced to that period. And I think it's important to have a look at where those ideals came from, where they've gone, what was achieved, what opportunities were missed, what worked out rather differently from what people perhaps expected at the time. And yeah, in that way, I think it's, I'm kind of writing this book for, my children's generation, people who are growing up now, and looking at the world that they live in.
What do you think drove the emergence of counterculture in New Zealand? I'm kind of thinking about, in some ways, they were following a global trend and what was happening in America and, here Ashbury and San Francisco and places like that. But there also seems to be a kind of uniquely kind of Kiwi flavour to some of the way it emerged.
Yeah, that's what I was interested in. New Zealand has always been a kind of receptor for overseas culture. I think that's just something about being a little island, and also being a place that's been colonised. But I started off reading quite a lot about the counterculture movements, and as you say, San Francisco, what was happening in London at the time, the student uprisings in Paris, all this sort of thing. And of course that was all transmitted to New Zealand through media of different kinds. And it was appealing, I think, to youth in New Zealand. There was a certain section of people that could really relate to it. But I was interested in what our version of it was and why it was different. You can't pretend that New Zealand has exactly the same social conditions as San Francisco. There were some of the things, same pressures. You know, we had the Vietnam War did affect young New Zealanders. We didn't have conscription. I mean, no one was conscripted and sent off to fight in the war as they were in America, and I think that was the cause of the extreme tensions in the States. But there was compulsory military training, which was a real bone of contention for young people here, that their name could be lifted out of a ballot and they could be forced to go off and train. And once you're trained, who knows whether someone might say one day, okay, everyone who can use a gun, you're off to Vietnam. So this was a kind of threat. Same with the nuclear threat, and there was nuclear testing going on in the Pacific Ocean at the time. So we were aware of some of the same things and affected by them. But New Zealand did have its own way of assimilating these ideas, and I mean, we can go into it a bit more later on, perhaps. But it's those were the things I was looking at, and I think I found some. Let's put it that way. I think I found some quite unique New Zealand versions of this international movement.
At the start of the counterculture in New Zealand, it seems to be a very Pākehā movement, and dare I say, also quite middle class.
Yeah.
But that evolves and changes as it goes on.
I think so.
Can I ask about the role of Maori and Pacifica community in that evolution of the counterculture and how they got involved with those big societal changes?
Sure. I mean, there were always some Maori involved in different aspects of the counterculture movement. Just think of some individuals. Tama Poata, the actor and writer and activist, was a member of the PYM, Progressive Youth Movement, in Wellington in the 60s. You had, I think, you have to realise that the 60s in New Zealand, and this was the kind of conditions in which the counterculture, it was almost perfect conditions for it to emerge, because it was actually quite an affluent time. It was we'd come through the austerity of the war years, and economically things were on the up and up. We had virtually full employment in 1960. I mean, if this is, I think they only really counted men as being employed. Women had their job and that was in the home. I mean, it was very much the sort of conservative nuclear family model. But student bursaries went up. There were more young people going to university than ever before. A lot of people were the first generation of their family to go to university. Flats were really cheap, I mean, it was, in a way, if you were ever going to, if you ever had a safety net from which you could sort of take risks and ask questions and drop out and do all these things, it had never been a better time for that in New Zealand. So, of course, it did start with, as you say, the middle classes, but there were certainly Maori involved in different ways. Someone like the activist and artist Tamaiti, when he first got to Auckland, I think it would have been in the late 60s, having grown up in, I think he was from Ruatoki, in the Urewera, with speaking Te Reo, first language, and he'd had this experience of being forbidden to speak Maori at school, and from a very young age he realised that this was unjust. Gets to Auckland, falls in with some underground magazine publishers and some budding feminists, and realises that his issues as a Maori, have so much in common with all these other liberation movements. And he articulated this very clearly. So I think, Maori particularly, were, they did in some ways borrow a form from the counterculture. There was an occupation of Parliament, Parliament grounds in I think it was in 1969 or 70, to draw attention to this issue of Maori use of Maori language in schools. And so, and in fact, they got some criticism at the time from more traditional Maori leaders for adopting Pākehā methods of protest. But I mean, it does flow both ways. Also, a lot of Maori musicians involved in the counterculture. That's another element which I talk about in the book.
I'm looking forward to talking a lot about music later on.
Sure.
Jumping Sundays. It's a hugely readable and wonderful and important work. And what I really liked about it is the level of research and detail in the book is stunning. But it's also incredibly readable, you don't need to have a huge interest to pick up and find it a fascinating tale. It pulls you in. And I suspect it must have taken ages to research. How can you tell us a little bit about your research methods, Nick? How long did it take? Where did you go? How did you get all these amazing interviews?
Yeah. Research methods, I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I started off by reading everything that had already been written on the subject, starting internationally, really, to get the picture of this movement, and then moving closer to the source, to my catchment, which is what happened in New Zealand. And I was quite surprised no one had written this book, actually, because it seems like such a rich subject. People had done quite a lot of work on individual strands of the counterculture. There was some academic work on the commune movement in New Zealand. People had written about the rise of women's liberation. There'd been stuff on sex and contraception in the 60s and things. But no one had actually tried to show the connections between these things. And this is what I could see it as, that the even things that's, you think, well, what have psychedelic drugs got to do with people going off and starting communes in the country? Well, there are all sorts of overlaps, and I wanted to show the connections. So you read what other people have already written, you identify what hasn't been done. You start picking out names of people who are obviously significant, people who might have been publishers of underground literature, people who were spreading some of these ideas around society. And you start tracking them down, and one inevitably leads to another. You find one person and you interview them, and they'll say, I know the person you've really got to talk to about this is so-and-so, who is still living in the Coromandel subsisting on a piece of land there or something. So it's a big jigsaw puzzle, and you just start finding the pieces and sticking them together. I mean, there's also, there's libraries. I spent an awful lot of time in the Turnbull Library, going through, there are actually scrapbooks, diaries, photographic collections. There's clues in all of that stuff. It's a bit of a detective job, really, but one thing leads you to another, and you follow hunches, and people help you.
Can I ask about the role of women in the counterculture of the time? Feminist issues didn't really seem to be in the movement's initial agenda, but again, I think with the arrival of Jim Greer and the feminist movement in America, it gets more prominent.
Yeah, well, Jim and Greer coming to New Zealand was a real watershed, I think, for the counterculture, as much as for the and for the wider mainstream culture, as much as it was just for the feminist movement in New Zealand, because Yeah, I mean, she's interesting without going into too much detail about her. She was, yeah, I mean, she did have this proposition that society needed to be liberated, not just women. I mean, women were clearly oppressed. But if we go back to the beginnings of the counterculture, yep, it was middle class as we identified, also very male dominated. I mean, it's funny how people set out to question everything, and that was this kind of tenet of the counterculture. You know, we're going to challenge everything. But there were some things that they were very slow to challenge. The male spokespeople of the counterculture tended not to question this patriarchal sort of hegemony, really. And this was certainly discovered when groups of counterculturists started moving to the country to set up their kind of alternative ways of life. And the women in these groups would frequently find that they were expected to mind the children, do the washing, cook the meals, and what's more, do these not under 20th century conditions, but sort of like colonial pioneers. And there was a lot of disillusionment expressed by women in those communities. That said, feminism didn't strictly arise as a reaction against the counterculture. I mean, it was more than that. It was reacting against the role of women in society, in the wider society. But I think what happened, and I deal with this sort of a bit towards the end of the book, that what at one point seemed like a unified movement that had all these different strands to it did start to separate. And I think you saw this with Maori as well, going, well, we have particular causes, you know, land, language, that are more of a priority to us than, say, changing the laws about drugs or something, you know. And the same with the women's movement, I think. There was a point where a lot of people in that movement decided that they had some really particular issues to fight, and they were going to focus on those. And, you know, they could leave the communards and the druggies and the spiritual seekers. They could go off and look after themselves. They were going to focus on their particular cause.
One of the things that I really liked about the book is how it talks about that distant point in time that perhaps not that many people are as familiar with as they should be, perhaps. Do you think that younger people struggle in particular to connect with the counterculture and indeed the more general society of that time? I was thinking about that L.P. Hartley poem that said, you know, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently here. And the world seems in some ways so different from what it was like.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to a historian about this recently, who was just talking about his flatmates and things, I think. And he was saying, you know, most people don't really appreciate history. You know, a lot of people, there's now and there's the past. And the past was different, and at some point it became now. But they don't think about the stages that it took to get from there to here, or the fact that where we are now is not the way things are going to be forever either. You know, that this is just a moment in history and it's a continuum. So, yeah, I mean, that's one of the purposes of writing a book like this with stories, to give people a way of seeing how we got to where we are now, filling in some of those gaps. I hope that works. I mean, I hope that's what you hope to do, is to bring that country of the past, bring it into the present, and make it feel alive, so that people today can pick it up and feel like they're immersing themselves in that past.
Let's talk music. It's time.
Yeah, anytime.
I know we both love the worldwide music scene. And I was thinking about the music of the 60s, and it was truly revolutionary in so many ways. And what I was actually thinking in particular is bands like the Beatles or the Stones, Neil Young, the Doors, still have popularity and real popularity now. But if you look at New Zealand bands from that time, there doesn't seem to be a band that has moved through time in those sort of ways. Do you think? I know there wasn't much of a record industry at the time. What do you think the reasons? Twofold question: why do you think that is? And two, do you think there's any bands of the time that need reappraising? And you said actually they were the band that should have been New Zealand's Beatles.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, you did put your finger on it with the record industry. In that period, there were dozens and dozens of bands. I mean, there were two kinds, really, broadly, of pop music in New Zealand. I mean, there was the stuff that did get on the radio, which was often New Zealand groups or singers doing cover versions of songs from overseas, and that got played on the radio, and it was quite popular, sold quite large quantities. But there was also this independent music circuit, and a lot of it was centered on the campuses. There was a band, Blurter, that would tour in the painted bus, and set up in little community halls and play concerts and put on children's shows and things. But a lot of those groups on that, basically the counterculture soundtrack, never recorded. That was beyond their budget. There were groups, when I was first going out and listening to bands as a teenager, these were the groups I would see. And whole repertoires of original music that actually has just vanished into the ether. Some of it was never recorded. Some possibly was, demoed. I mean, this is the scene that, say, Split Enz originally came out of. When I first saw them, they hadn't made a record yet. And they were playing these sort of dazzling original songs. And there were, they were one that did keep going and broke through and created quite a catalogue of recorded music. But I mean, there's a whole area to look at of bands that, little trails of music that you could make a fascinating collection from that.
My final question, Nick, is, so it went on for a long while, and I think it kind of lasted longer in New Zealand than many other countries. What do you think were the factors that led to its collapse eventually?
Yeah. Well, I think there was a point where you could see that it had broken off into these individual interest groups that hadn't necessarily run out of steam. But it's complex, but part of it, I think, was a change in economic fortunes of the country as a whole. It was much easier, I think, to live a countercultural existence, to challenge society from a position of relative security. When flats were really cheap, jobs were plentiful if you needed them. Then you also had, by the 80s, the mid-80s, you had these major economic reforms, and a sort of increased emphasis on individualism. I mean, one thing about the counterculture is that it focused really on collective activities, a commune rather than a nuclear family in the suburbs. Jumping Sundays, hundreds of thousands of people coming together and dancing in the parks. I think, universities, for example, user pays education and student loans were introduced. That discourages collective activity. It turns you all into sort of individual clients. So yeah, I think there was this may be simplifying it, overly simplifying it, but those things are very significant in terms of ending the sense that there was a counterculture.
Nick Bollinger, thank you so much for that interview. It was a real pleasure. For anybody who's interested in New Zealand culture, past, music, a whole range of subjects, Jumping Sundays is an essential read. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much.